Welcome, everyone, to the New Rules of Podcasting on YouTube webinar. Today, we're going to share with you findings from a brand new research study that we conducted. And we first shared this at the Podcast Movement Conference a couple of weeks ago in Denver. And today in this webinar, we're going to split up the findings in two halves, essentially. So the first half of what you're going to see today are the results of this study with perceptions and usage of podcasting within the broader podcasting universe. And when we get into the second half of the presentation, you're going to see us focus on perceptions and usage of podcasting specifically within the YouTube universe with people that are using YouTube for podcasting. And from that, hopefully you'll start to understand some of the what's and the how's and even some of the whys of behavior of those consumers in that audience, so you can start to develop and formulate a strategy of if and how you should be on YouTube moving forward. So my name is Jay Nachlis, and I'm a consultant at Coleman Insights. We are a media research firm. We've been around doing this kind of work for 45 years. I've been here for 6 of those 45. And we're audio research specialists. So we do work in the podcasting, radio, and streaming industries.
My name is Steve Goldstein, and I run a company called Amplifi Media. We are strategic audio advisors, and we work with brands and companies and podcasters, pretty much pan audio. And I've been doing Amplifi since BS, before Serial. So that's about 9 years ago. I'm also an adjunct professor at NYU. Focused on the business of podcasting. It's the first course at a major university. It's not about how to make a podcast. It is about the business of podcasting. And before we get going, put on the professor hat or jacket or whatever, just for a moment, I thought we would set the scene on how we arrived at doing this study. And sort of dividing podcast into 3 eras, and the first era would be the MeUndies era, and that would be a lot of baked-in ads, a lot of mattress ads. How many mattresses do you own? All the endorsements. Public radio was in very early. Serial, as I mentioned, that was a quantum change, and then Apple Podcast takes their app native at the same time into the iOS. And so that was a big game changer, which sort of brought us to the second era. And by the way, in the first era, maybe there was $250,000 in the whole business. And by the second era, we had companies coming in and sort of the spaghetti against the wall era, a lot of ad tech and dynamic ad insertion, big businesses trying to figure out where they wanted to be in the podcast space. We're talking about the Sirius XMs and the Spotifys and Apple trying to figure out their role. And it was mostly about building audience and building share and a whole lot of content. Some of it really bad, some of it really great. Now we're sort of moving into yet another era, and it's the third era. And it involves lots of apps and distribution and changes. I mean, you remember Fireside with Mark Cuban, that was a big announcement, and Facebook was in podcast. Do you remember that? That was a year and a month that they were in podcasting. What happened to Twitter podcasts? What happened to Twitter? Who knows? But that's sort of where we are. And now comes YouTube. And YouTube has moved rapidly. We've seen studies over the past couple of years as it's growing and growing, and now it is dominant. But it is different. It is a bit vexing for most podcasters because it does involve video. There's no RSS feed. There will be, but right now there isn't. It's video-based, and 3.7 million people are uploading content. Videos are uploaded every day, 500 hours every minute. I mean, it's just incredible how big it is. So I think many podcasters have had a tough time figuring out where they fit here. Some have even talked about bailing out. That might not be wise. But what we're going to do today is distill our findings and give you some actionable takeaways that may help you sort of figure out a bespoke strategy for YouTube.
So before we get into the findings of the study, let's talk about who is in it, our sample composition. So first things first, if you were going to get into the study, you had to say you've consumed a podcast within the past month. Now, I want to draw your attention for a moment to that word consumed, because you might be used to seeing research like this where, the word listened is used. But we're going to really explore listening and watching in podcasting throughout this study. And so we didn't want to bias the sample. We didn't want to bias the survey in any way, particularly in the beginning of the study, before we got into YouTube specific type things. So instead, we use the more generic word consumed. So particularly in the beginning, when you see that, that's why we use the word consume and consumption. We wanted to make sure that we had a really big representative sample size. So we spoke to 1,000 podcast consumers across the United States. They were as young as 15, as old as 64, and we had quotas in place for age, gender, ethnicity, and region based on the population. Big headline from this study today: the definition of a podcast is changing. We hear all the time, everybody's got their opinions of what a podcast is, particularly in the podcast industry. You hear about what people think. So you may think that if it's not audio only, it's not a podcast. As Steve mentioned a few minutes ago, it's not an RSS feed, it's not a podcast. But we thought it was really important in this study to take it outside of the industry and figure out, what are podcast consumers saying? What do they think a podcast is? So we came up with a pretty simple way of asking it. How would you define a podcast? And they were given 3 choices: audio or video, audio only, and video only. And 75% of podcast consumers in the United States said that a podcast should be defined as audio or video. 22% said audio only, and 3% said video only. Now, we were curious as to whether or not, if you preferred YouTube for podcasts, was this skewing the data at all? So we really wanted to dig this in by platform preference. So of those that said that a podcast should be defined as audio or video, there's that number you just saw: 75% of all podcast consumers feel this way. Now, when we look at specifically people that prefer YouTube to get their podcasts, it is a higher number that say audio or video. It's 89%. But look at what happens when we bring in those who prefer Apple Podcasts and Spotify to get their podcasts. It's still more than 2/3 of that audience. So it's really important to note here that definition, this changing definition of a podcast being audio or video, is not just among YouTube fans. It's among users of multiple platforms. So now that you know the changing ways that people are defining podcasts, you're going to see some of the changing ways of how people are consuming their podcasts. And this is how we ask this question. If you first started consuming your podcast, how did you first start consuming it? Was it via audio only? Was it video only? Or was it using both audio and video? And when people said they started first consuming their favorite podcast, more than half said they did it in an audio only manner. But look at what they say they're doing now with their favorite podcast. More people are using both audio and video than audio only. That is a significant shift in usage behavior. I will note here that 39% still say that they're using audio only for their favorite podcast. That's not an insignificant number. And so this is one of the few times that we're going to say a few times within this presentation that video isn't the only answer. There is certainly a room for audio only, and that's what that says there. We wondered whether or not people were tethered to one podcast app. That was a perception that we saw out there. But in fact, 72% of all podcast consumers are using multiple apps for consumption. So which ones are they using? Which services, apps, or destinations do you currently use for podcasts? And YouTube is reported as the #1 destination for podcasts. 60% of those 1,000 people in this survey report using YouTube for podcasts. That's followed closely by Spotify at 53%, Apple Podcasts quite a bit behind at 30%. But take a look at this top 10 and look at number 9. Now, we specifically broke up YouTube and YouTube Music, and we specified that they were different apps when we asked about this. You may know that YouTube Music has only been offering podcasts for a few months. And you might have gotten a push alert, for example, as I did a few months ago, from YouTube inviting me to go over to YouTube Music for podcasts. So there's an effort being made there. And it's interesting that already 13% are reporting that they're currently using YouTube Music for podcasts. So we expect that only to grow, and that's a number that we're really going to want to keep our eye on. Which service, app, or destination do you use most often for podcasts? So these are the three that you just saw in that last graph on the top: YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Well, when we call these the big three, it's because of this. 73% of podcast consumers prefer one of these three apps. So are there a lot of podcast platforms available? Yes, but 3/4 prefer just one of these three. So that other 27% of preference is spread amongst everybody else. And if you look at some of those below, there's some really big brands out there trying to compete amongst the crumbs. Which service, app, or destination you use for podcasts is partly influenced by how old you are. And the answer to this question was pretty surprising to us, actually. If you are over the age of 25, you're more likely to use YouTube for podcasts. If you're under the age of 25, you're slightly more likely to use Spotify for podcasts. Now, how about podcast frequency? Among that entire sample, 40% say that they're consuming podcasts on a daily basis, 49% on a weekly basis, and 11% monthly. But this brings us to another question, another perception that we'd heard, which is, okay, yeah, YouTube, people are using YouTube for podcasts, but those that are using YouTube, maybe they're not as engaged, and maybe they're not using podcasts as often. Well, let's take a look. First is that total universe number that we just saw in the last graph. All podcast consumers, and 40% are using them daily. And here are the other big three: Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. And what you're going to notice here, if you look on the right, those that are using YouTube for podcasts, that graph on the right pretty much looks like the ones to the left of it. So there's no significant finding here that the behavior in frequency among those who are using YouTube for podcasts is any significantly different than those using the other big two. We asked this question: how long have you been consuming podcasts? And there was an answer that just kept coming up a lot.
2 years, almost 3 years.
Maybe 3 years ago at the most, but definitely 2 years ago I started listening.
I want to say it's been 2 to 3 years.
That's about 2 years ago.
So this 2 years, this 3 years kept coming up. So we were really curious about how many new people are coming into the podcasting medium. So we specifically broke out this data into the people that said that they've been consuming podcasts for 2 years or less. And among that entire sample of podcast consumers, 39%, pretty big number, have been using podcasting for 2 years or less. And when you look at the youngest component of the sample, the 15 to 24-year-olds, check out how almost 6 in 10 have been using podcasting for 2 years or less. So when you really think about the changing definitions, the changing usage patterns, it starts to really make sense because so many different people, new people, are coming into the medium for the first time. And podcast discovery is changing as well. When this question is asked in research, and this gets asked a lot, how do you discover new podcasts? Almost every single time, the number one answer is friends and family. And it is the number one answer here. But look at what's number two. The number two way that they say they discover new podcasts is from a YouTube video. 50% of podcast app or service.
And that would be my cue. So now let's zero in on YouTube. So Jay mentioned, and great job, Jay, the overall sample is about 1,000. Now we're focused on the people who said that they chose to consume podcasts on YouTube, including this gentleman.
Wow. Why do I choose YouTube over other platforms? I'm going to tell you something. This is $1 million question right here. Can't believe you only paying me $20 for this answer.
Well, we didn't have $1 million to pay him, but we did offer him an extra 20 if he'd put his shirt on. So why do you choose to consume podcasts on YouTube? That was the question that we asked versus all the others. Well, number one, it's free. Okay, scary and true, but most of the platforms are free at some level. Because it has video at 60%. So that is part of the appeal, sort of makes sense for YouTube consumers, right? But there it is. And then maybe, even though it's the lower percentage number, it is the bigger issue. And that is because you already use YouTube for other things. It's the source. It's the go-to. Are all your favorite podcasts on YouTube? So this was a really important and interesting finding. And what we learned here is that a lot of people said no. I cannot find my favorite podcasts on YouTube. So maybe they're using another app and they're finding the podcast there, but maybe they're searching on YouTube and your podcast isn't on YouTube. So if you get nothing else out of this session, how about make sure your podcast is on YouTube? As they say in the lottery business, you can't win if you don't play. Okay, so YouTube has a podcast page. And I think that that is one of the stranger findings here is that it is not universally used or well known. It's not the same as Apple or Spotify. So did you know there was a specific page labeled podcasts on YouTube? And yes, okay, so about half say yes, but how many of them are using it? Have you visited the page? And the answer is about 4 out of 10. How do you search for podcasts on YouTube? This was another really interesting question. My concern at the very beginning of this project was that people were choosing categories. They were interested in car podcasts, but maybe they got car videos. Okay, well, that does happen. But typing in the name of a specific show is the number one way, 65%. So they're going for something that they know of already. Next is typing a category into the search box. That's the car sort of thing. And then finally, clicking on podcasts that YouTube recommends. And that's a big number, 42%. Recommendation engine, critically important. Okay, so again, this is among respondents of YouTube. When I search for podcasts on YouTube, do I get what I'm looking for? And we took strongly agree and agree, and we put it into the purple there at 93%. So yes, people are finding what they were looking for with a big exclamation mark. It's easy to discover new podcasts on YouTube. In other words, there's that plethora of content issue again, and everything else that's on YouTube. And 87% say, no, this is working for me. How about subscribing to podcasts? And keep in mind that the nomenclature is different now. We have on Spotify and on Apple, they no longer ask for you to subscribe unless it is that they want money from you. And yet on YouTube, everything is subscribe. So keep in mind and keep thinking about this in terms of how you handle this during your podcast when you encourage people to subscribe. So do you subscribe to any specific podcasts on YouTube? And the answer is about half to. This was another really important finding. And some of you may intuitively know this if you're using YouTube Shorts, but it has become a monster. It is as popular in many circles as TikTok and growing rapidly. And what we really learned is that this is a marvelous promotion platform for podcasts. Have you ever heard of YouTube Shorts? Yes, 9 out of 10. Have you ever watched a YouTube Shorts video? Absolutely. Have you ever discovered a podcast for the first time by seeing it promoted on YouTube Shorts? That 4 out of 10 number startled us, really big. That suggests that there's something going on here. And I can tell you also how the algorithm works, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, how the algorithm works between YouTube for Shorts and YouTube Regular. And that is quite advantageous for podcasters using YouTube Shorts. This is a YouTube short. It comes from our friends at Wondery, and it's about the show Smartless. Julia Louis-Dreyfus was the guest.
And I remember thinking when I was really little, I just had to meet Barbara Streisand. I knew that if we met each other, that we would become such best friends. I just knew it in my heart. And I had the opportunity to meet her decades later. We were at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and I saw she was over there, and I've got to say something. And so and I went over to her and I said, "Hey, Barbara, I'm Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and I just wanted to tell you it was just such a treat to meet you." And she said, "No, I already told them what I wanted."
So that's a lift from the show, and they turned it into a cartoon thing. I have no idea how much that costs. Maybe it's a lot, maybe it isn't. And with AI these days, who knows? That wasn't our point. Our point was that there's elbow grease going into this. And so that probably makes a difference. Okay, so we did a face-off. We did it between YouTube and Spotify. We also did it between YouTube and Apple. So this is the one with Spotify, obviously. Which is more enjoyable? Wow. Look at the YouTube number. Again, these are people who have chosen YouTube podcasts, but they really like YouTube for podcasts. 67% say it's easier to use. 62%, also really interesting, says it makes better podcast recommendations. Now let's do the same thing for Apple. Stacks a little bit differently. It's easier to use YouTube than Apple Podcasts by far. It's more enjoyable to consume podcasts by far, and makes better recommendations by far. So let's roll into some findings, and we're going to bang our way through these.
All right, and just a quick note as we come down towards the stretch here. If you have any questions that you want to ask us, you can put that into the chat box there at the top, and we will try to get to a few of those at the end of this. So 7 key findings, some takeaways from the study. Number one, big headline I showed you earlier, the definition of a podcast has changed. And along with the definition of a podcast, this is really a language change. This is thinking about not just saying listening to a podcast. People now are starting to consider that a podcast is video or audio, and so watch or listen probably should seep into the language. And that's really important to keep tabs on.
I remember getting a call from Pierre Bouvard over at Westwood One. He was looking at some custom data that they had done a few years ago, and YouTube was popping into the study as a significant factor. It was the first time he'd seen it, first time I'd seen it. Well, now you see this in all the studies. YouTube is the #1 app for podcasts, and it is in this study as well. But importantly, it's not just for younger demos. And if that's a bias that you have, you should probably erase that.
4 out of 10 podcast consumers prefer audio only. So listen, you're hearing a lot about the benefits of video. You're hearing a lot about the benefits of YouTube, but we're not saying that YouTube or video in its purest form is the best solution for every podcast. And there are still a significant number of consumers that are consuming their favorite podcast via audio only, and they need to be served as well.
Absolutely. This was another huge finding. Podcast consumers use multiple platforms. I think the common thinking in the business has been you pick a platform and you work the platform. Well, people apparently migrate to whatever it is that they're using at a particular time. And so 72% told us they use multiple platforms.
1 out of 4 YouTube podcast consumers can't find their favorite podcast there. So that's a land of opportunity. You've seen that there are a lot of people using YouTube for podcasts, and yet a significant number can't find their favorite podcast. So are you one of their favorite podcasts? Perhaps that's an opportunity for you to be on there for sure. And number 7, 40% of YouTube podcast consumers discovered a new podcast on Shorts. As Steve said a few minutes ago, that is just a big opportunity. It's a marketing opportunity. So whether or not you decide if your podcast itself, if the episode should be on YouTube, that's one decision. But from a marketing opportunity, that's an everything and everybody decision that everybody can use. It's organic, and it's a great way to reach consumers.
So we said we were going to provide you with some new rules, and I want to put a caveat on this. The rules change in this business so fast. So these are rules that are pretty good for today. Who knows what happens next week? But we think that there's some good guidance here. And that is, the first one is create a bespoke strategy for each podcast platform. How you deal with Spotify is different than how you deal with Apple. If you're using any of the other platforms, as niche or different as they may be, you're probably doing something that is centric to that platform. Well, that's the case here. And you just need to rethink where video plays in and where you want to be as a podcaster on this platform.
I think it's pretty clear that you can't ignore YouTube. What you decide to do on YouTube is going to change for every podcaster, but you can't ignore it. And harnessing the power of its reach is a massive audience development opportunity. It is the #2 search engine next to Google. It is owned by Google, and it's an incredible opportunity. And I would also add here that it's kind of standard fare that you hear everywhere you get your podcasts, but you don't necessarily hear the platforms. And I think you pretty rarely hear YouTube. So if you're on an audio first platform, you may want to take the opportunity, if your podcast is on YouTube, to tell your consumers that it's available there.
So teased this earlier, and that is optimizing for YouTube. It is its own monster. You're competing against not just podcast content, but all content. It's a giant. So you need to be thinking about that. You need to think visually. That doesn't mean you need to be creating an epic, and it may not be as great as that SmartLess video, but there needs to be something that's visually appealing. I mentioned that I started teaching my class, and in the very first class, they were telling me how sometimes if they're using YouTube, they do watch something for a moment, but then they're moving on to whatever they're doing, walking, driving, doing, cooking, whatever it may be. One of the other things that we've learned is the algorithm, the YouTube algorithm, and it's worth digging in, and YouTube has provided counsel on that. My God, there was a 67-page document on how to do YouTube and podcasts, but this is what we melted it down to. Keywords and consistency, meaning how often you publish. The titles and the descriptions and the categories and the tags really require scrutiny. And then you also have a channel, and that's where your content lives. And hygiene in that channel is really important. How you look on that channel makes a difference. And it also empowers the whole algorithm.
Put your shorts on. 40% of YouTube podcast consumers discovered a new podcast on YouTube Shorts. This number seems ridiculous, but it's true. 50 billion views per day. So we mentioned here Shorts has a clipping tool. So, this is about making videos that are 60 seconds or less. They're great for teasers to drive people to your full episodes. Whether or not Shorts is their clipping tool is the best tool for you, or whether or not it's the best tool to use, is kind of up to you. There are a lot of other tools out there available, but this is a big marketing opportunity that certainly shouldn't be missed.
All right. And really determine the role of video for your podcast. Some it's more natural, right? If you're an interview series, it might make sense to do the video. If you're doing a narrative series, probably doesn't make as much sense. And that's why we mentioned that you should have a video strategy that's bespoke. And it may just mean that you're putting up some kind of general visual that goes along with the podcast. That's going to be very iterative. I think people are going to experiment with a lot of different things, and that's where we are. That's what you should be doing.
And certainly remember that it's evolving, and it's evolving quickly. There's a lot changing. I'm sure YouTube's algorithms are going to change in about 5 minutes from now. And be patient. You know, this is not a YouTube themselves who are at Podcast Movement said themselves, this is going to take time. There's going to be adjustments made. And yes, there are times where you're going to get frustrated with their analytics. You're going to get frustrated with the RSS feed. You get frustrated with the numbers, but we believe that over time, having a video strategy, having a YouTube strategy is going to pay off to be on the platform. And results are going to vary depending on both how you're optimizing it, as Steve pointed out, and also the type of podcast you have. There's a lot of different variables. So be patient. The full presentation deck that you just saw is now available for download. So we have made it available at a couple different places. You can go to colemaninsights.com and also amplifimedia.com to download it. I'll put my smiling face back on the screen as well.
There we go. Yeah. So we do have a little time for some questions. Well, we're in the webinar chat. There's one here that asks what the difference in revenue is on YouTube versus the audio platforms, Apple, Spotify, and that is certainly evolving. Most podcasters are getting insertion of their ads via YouTube. That's the revenue that they're getting. That may not be optimal for you. There are going to be more opportunities as the RSS feed becomes standardized. But we did not really focus on that. That was not the point of this study. This study was about where consumers are shopping for podcasts. Monetization, I mean, my view is always that sales dollars chase ears. It'll all get figured out.
There's, I see a couple of variations of this question. It's the same question asked different ways. So I'll pick one here from John, who says, what's your findings on a YouTube podcast with a looping graphic static image? So mostly audio driven versus a full-on video recorded podcast, AKA talking heads. This was a question that we did ask about your preference of different ways of it being shown on YouTube, showing the hosts, showing an animated graphic, or showing a static image. And certainly showing the hosts was the most preferable, followed by the animated graphic, followed by the static image. So the more engaging you make the video, the better. Recognizing, though, that where there are some podcasts where just showing the hosts doing the full podcast makes sense. There are others that don't. I mean, that's going to be one that varies. But I think the point of the research is the more engaging the video, certainly the better.
Here's a question from Tim. Is there a clear difference between what is considered a podcast and general but regular UGC on a platform like YouTube? I'm not sure I completely understand the question, so I'm going to answer this way and hope I'm doing this correctly. We don't really care what we call a podcast. There's a lot of people who are stuck on the RSS feed and the purity of all of that. As we're looking at what people are doing on the platform, we think that's just morphing. And so I think there needs to be some mental dexterity on how you view podcast versus audio. And that may enable you or free you up to think more liberally about how to use YouTube.
Question here from Mike. He says, silly question. No question is silly, Mike. But can I just post an audio podcast on YouTube, or does there have to be a video component? There doesn't have to be a video component, but if you're going to be on YouTube, there are a lot of tools available to put your audio without, I think, as you said, Steve, earlier, like being Steven Spielberg, right? But the other thing I would point out is like Smartless, which is a top 10 podcast. If you go look at Smartless and the way that they're optimized on YouTube, it's very easy to find the episodes of Smartless. But when you watch the episodes, it's actually not, Will and Sean and Jason. It's not them doing the podcast. It's like this animated graphic that goes around a little bit and plays the audio, and that's the whole thing. And it does very, very well. But there are other podcasts on YouTube, notable podcasts that aren't even showing their latest episodes because, again, that RSS feed doesn't make it super easy. So you need to put some work into how it's optimized, and how it looks.
My friend Cheryl from Salt Lake City is asking the question, when will YouTube actually deploy the RSS? We'll know more about that. We have a meeting with them coming up, but what they said at Podcast Movement was before the end of the year. But I would also expect that it's going to be in 2 phases. YouTube Music with a more full RSS feed, and then something more limited in the general YouTube environment.
Let's see. You got anything else you want to cover here, or should we move it to our contact info on the screen?
There's one here that talks about Shorts and TikTok and Instagram and the performance of those, and we were totally agnostic on all of this, but totally familiar with what you're talking about, and this just goes to having to go through the rigor of understanding each of these platforms and figuring out how it's going to work best for your podcast. I don't think there's any, pardon the pun, shortcuts.
Okay, excellent. Well, if you take a look there at the screen, you can see my email address and Steve's email address, and we are more than happy to answer any of your questions. If you want to email us directly and start that conversation, we will certainly do that. You can connect with us in LinkedIn. We're both on there as well. We mentioned the websites, which are part of our email addresses, ColemanInsights.com and AmplifiMedia.com. Please go check it out. We will have a recording of this webinar up in a few days. And the presentation deck is available for download now on both of our websites. So thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon for the presentation. We will see you soon. Steve, thanks very much. Great working with you.
Thank you very much. Great job, Jay, and fun to work with you. And I got to say, we greatly appreciate your time.